Whose Line Is It Anyway started in 1988 as a British radio show before making the leap to television, combining the wit of its cast with the insanity of short-form improvisation. When Drew Carey watched the show to see his friend and co-star Ryan Stiles, he thought it might do well on American TV. He pitched the idea to ABC, and in 1998 it began to air every week after his creatively named sitcom, The Drew Carey Show. Even though it was put in a terrible time slot, it did better than expected, and the cheap production costs kept it afloat until 2004. I don't remember many specifics of my childhood, but I remember watching Whose Line Is It Anyway constantly with my family, even when it was a rerun. Over a decade later, I found that nearly every one of my friends loves the show just as much as I did, and dozens of classic moments are practically chiseled into our heads.
I'm as much fun to make as I am to eat.
After its cancellation, Whose Line was revived thrice. Shortly after it was canned, Drew Carey's green screen show made its debut, but only lasted one season. After a 7-year hiatus, it popped up as Drew Carey's Improviganza, a lavish stage show taped in Vegas that also only lasted one season. Although that season had 40 episodes. A few years after that, it was rebooted on the CW under its original name with most of the cast. But Drew Carey, who is now hosting The Price is Right, had been replaced with Aisha Tyler. That show is still running and is now in its 7th season. However, even though it's found more success than the spin-offs, you're still far more likely to see references to the original run of Whose Line than the reboot. That first show had some sort of unique magic that feels indescribable. So let's describe it. It's hard to picture America without Hollywood. For over a century, our films have dominated global culture, and while film and television is created all over the world, it's hard to deny that America dominates the landscape. Our society revolves around these shows and the people who make them, and many foreigners believe these films represent the average American. Yet, we're all aware that's not the case. There's a sensationalized facade layered over our film's portrayal of even the most destitute American. Even if we relate to a show, we still see, at best, a glamorized representation of our lives. Even the broke college dropout on TV is more handsome, more wealthy, and more interesting than anyone we know in real life. As much as we enjoy our television, there's still a part of us that resents these unattainable people we see on screen. And what better antidote for an abundance of highly polished shows full of beautiful people than the opposite?
Oh, this is a special dog blend I make up myself.
Hey, how's it taste?
Oh, it's very...
When I look back at Whose Line, what stands out to me the most was the sheer authenticity. We were in the era of Friends at the time, and TV was pretty saccharine. Most comedy, at least what I was allowed to watch, was pretty sanitized and didn't feel real. Even game shows built their branding out of an escapist, perfect atmosphere.
Haven't you always seen them stop down there in contestants row?
Yes.
Well, then why did you try to come up here like that?
Great excitement.
Is that it? All right, then all is forgiven.
The performative nature of television, whether it's narrative, home improvement, or, ironically, reality, places a barrier between the audience and the art. There's an ulterior motive behind every show: profit. So, no matter how pure the intent of the creator is, the show has, to some extent, been crafted to manipulate its audience into staying. This doesn't make television bad, it's just a reality about producing such expensive entertainment. An incredibly well-written drama still needs to use cliffhangers to make sure the ratings stay up. A great sitcom maintains a status quo to keep the audience comfortable, so major plot points and character development rarely happen. These little lies and manipulations are, for better or worse, necessary to the medium. Whose Line just didn't care. Even though the show is a performance, like all other television, their approach to performance is different than most other shows. Instead of performing a reality, the show is about the reality of the performance. They're not hiding any aspect of the production. Outside of the games that don't air, I suppose. They throw things at the camera, play with the audience, and consistently undermine the importance of themselves, their show, and even their network.
What Drew whispers in his date's ear. What's your name again?
I think it's really vitally important that we acknowledge how incredible the team off-camera must have been. On the DVD collection of the series, we get to see a lot of the moments where the cast pushed a little too far, and the producers had to stop the filming to tell them they were running a bit blue.
Bill Cosby and Hitler are certainly unlikely roommates. If ever there were unlikely roommates. So, you gotta be kidding me, come on.
Not that Hitler.
While it's easy to say they're being a buzzkill or censoring the comedians, it's clear that they had a good sense of humor and played along with the jokes, and they were just making sure they didn't get groups calling for their cancellation. The atmosphere could have been incredibly hostile in these moments, but the fact that these interruptions are some of the funniest moments in Whose Line speaks a great deal about the production team's ability to run a good set and keep a healthy environment. I've worked on a lot of sets, and believe me, if they aren't capable of sticking to a schedule and keeping the environment healthy, everything else falls apart. They enable the performers. Speaking of which...
I was just joking around trying to get a little laugh, but it was just sarcasm is what it was.
Yeah, well, words can hurt.
I'm really, really sorry.
Don't you think a hug is in store here?
The chemistry between this cast is just phenomenal. While the rotating cast member could be hit or miss, Colin, Ryan, Wayne, and Drew were always on point. And that doesn't mean perfect. While they're all talented, the nature of improvised comedy means that you're going to have scenes that simply don't work now and then. Thankfully, the nature of improvised comedy also means that the failed scenes can turn into your greatest moments.
I will drive 1,000 miles an hour around the block, and you'll be God motherfucking shit.
The same way that the production team maintained an atmosphere that enabled a show like Whose Line to exist, the on-camera talent maintained an atmosphere that actually made the show funny. I've seen a lot of improv, and I'll never forget one long-form improv show I saw 10 years ago. It was bad. Very bad. The performers were so concerned with trying to think of amazing jokes or clever plot twists that they weren't really connecting with the audience or each other. They were trying so hard to be impressive that a wall had been built between us. You can't improvise for an audience and maintain an air of dignity at the same time. We are all, no matter how talented, fallible. If you're a performer, improv is going to show everyone just how fallible you are. So, you better roll with it.
Yeah, I know. It's oh my lord. I'm fine.
Oh my God!
Whose Line felt like a show completely devoid of self-importance. There was ego, sure, but that ego was acknowledged and used for laughs. There was a sense of real openness, and it was so refreshing and infectious. It's the core of that energy that makes improv so great. It's the form of acting that requires you to give the absolute most, or you'll get nowhere. And while several improvisers don't really think too highly of short-form improv games like the ones played on Whose Line, I think the atmosphere of the show itself embodies the spirit of improvisation perfectly. These performers are never phoning it in. They are always present and always giving to each other. And, in turn, us. This is on perfect display in my favorite moment from the entire run of the show.
What kind of bird always says the name of our next band?
Oh, I guess,
Turn? An Arctic tern? And what sound does an Arctic tern make? Backstreet Boys?
There are so many reasons that I love this bit, and I quote it constantly. Ryan and Colin played this game hundreds of times, yet they're still completely open and present in the moment. You don't break down as hard as Ryan did unless you're actually listening to what Colin is saying. And speaking of Colin, he is fully committed. There is not the slightest hint of shame or reservation as he makes a complete ass out of himself. And that's kind of something that Colin was really good at.
We're watching animal porn!
He had 2 seconds to figure out what to say, and he just went for it. And my favorite thing about this bit is something that runs through every great moment of the show, but is especially present whenever Ryan and Colin are together. There is just so much play. These are grown men making absolute asses out of themselves for hours on end for broadcast television, and they are happy to do it. This show does not make them look good. Well, outside of Wayne Brady, but he has a really hard time looking bad. Their appearance, their personality, Their personal lives and their careers are all free game, and they are totally fine with it. It's really comforting and inspiring to see such utterly naked humanity on a television screen. The world's greatest directors will spend years crafting a product that feels genuine, but the cast of Whose Line did it every episode. And unfortunately, I think that's a little of what was lost in the later renditions. Improviganza put them in a suit and tie on a massive stage. The audience was eating steak and drinking wine. The cast is still funny, but it felt more like a formal production than just a casual hangout with friends who happen to be funnier than you. The new reboot is better, for sure, but you can tell that even that's a little bit more sanitized, more corporate. The atmosphere is less anti-establishment, Aisha Tyler is more of your standard, beautiful TV host, and they constantly bring on guest stars to advertise the CW's other shows. It's funny, and it's still worth watching, but it doesn't quite feel the same. Maybe that's just what happens when something is brought back to be a product instead of actually being the original thing that it was. But hey, that's okay. The original run will always be there, and it will never stop being funny. And hey, maybe I'll eventually watch more of the British show, and the radio show, and maybe I'll find out that I like that just as much. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that I love comedy. It's the most powerful and flexible genre we have. It's capable of delivering powerful political messages, exploring difficult themes, and showing us the complexities of an entire human being in mere seconds. But sometimes, you also just need to smile. And there's nothing that turns my mood around quite like Whose Line Is It Anyway? It was just a bunch of comedians in a room having fun, with no claim to anything greater. And oddly enough, I think that's what gave it a greater purpose in my life. This is the show that made me laugh the hardest and taught me to love comedy. It's where I drew most of my inspiration when I started performing, and it's how I bonded with a lot of my first friends. Most personally, it speaks to that part of my creative side that always stresses about doing things right when I'm making something. It tells me to let go of my stress, put aside my shame, and just share the moment with those around me. The only thing we leave behind, and the only thing that we get to keep, are those shared moments. So, relax. After all, the rules are made up, and the points don't matter.